The internet called GBI a fraud because his last mock exam showed 47 points in math. Hours later, he solved the province's hardest exam problem on a blackboard before a live national audience. That was only the warm-up, because the supposed loser soon attacked a conjecture professional mathematicians had chased for generations. 3 years earlier, GBY had transmigrated into this world immediately after the body's original family died in a road accident. His uncle and aunt blamed his father, sued for the estate, and stripped away nearly everything the orphan should have inherited. The only thing left was a rundown apartment, terrible grades, part-time wages, and no adult willing to protect him. Then the daily choice system finally appeared, letting him spend a small daily allowance on impossible rewards. Its first purchase turned his hopeless college future into a result nobody in his broken school could explain. For 3 years, GB had survived without money, family support, useful connections, or any impressive academic record. Memories from his previous world existed, but famous songs, poems, and knowledge always felt frustratingly beyond reach. He sometimes recognized that something important should be familiar, yet the exact words or ideas refused to surface. School offered no rescue, because GB slept through lessons, handed in awful tests, and treated exams like background noise. His teachers saw a troublesome slacker, while the administration expected little from a student at school number 99. The school itself had such a weak reputation that simply getting students through the entrance exam counted as progress. GB had already taken the National College entrance examination and estimated that his real score barely reached 300. He had listed Peking University as his first choice, mostly as a joke, knowing his actual grades could never qualify. The morning after the exam, a blue system screen finally appeared after making him wait through 3 miserable years. It gave him 10 yuan worth of daily choices, with rewards priced according to their immediate usefulness and rarity. One option placed 10,000 yuan in his bank account, while another promised acceptance to Peking University. GB spent 2 yuan on the cash and 8 on the admission reward without wasting a second. His phone immediately confirmed the deposit, proving the strange screen could alter reality rather than merely display information. The university reward could not be verified until official results appeared, so GB went out and celebrated the money first. Across town, the principal received a call from the Education Bureau that nearly knocked him out of his chair. A student from his notorious school had scored 716 points, becoming the city's top science candidate. The same result placed that student 6th across the entire province, an achievement the school had never approached before. When the principal asked which class contained GB, the teachers assumed the boy had caused another problem. His homeroom teacher remembered blank tests, ridiculous jokes, and a history of treating school discipline like optional advice. The math teacher added that GB almost never stayed awake long enough to follow an entire lesson. Another teacher could not understand how someone who struggled with basic classroom material could suddenly dominate the province. The principal abruptly reframed every complaint as evidence of creativity, leaving the staff confused until he revealed the score. Once the identification number was checked, nobody could dismiss the result as another student sharing the same name. Teachers who had expected GB to scrape into a low-tier college were suddenly discussing a historic city champion. Meanwhile, GB sat in a mall restaurant ordering foods he had denied himself for years, because every coin mattered. He had survived on cheap buns, plain noodles, and internet cafe wages, sometimes unable to justify adding 1 egg. The first real meal after the system's cash reward felt more miraculous to him than any headline about school rankings. Teacher Li Mei called during the meal and nearly screamed while telling him the early internal score. B already knew the system had changed his future, yet hearing 716 spoken aloud still hit hard. He calmly described the result as normal, which only made Li Mei more convinced that he had hidden his ability. When she asked about his first choice university, GB confirmed the Peking application the systems had effectively guaranteed. School number 99 had never sent anyone there, turning his admission into a breakthrough for the entire faculty. The system then revealed that other people's shock generated points that could eventually upgrade its daily spending tier. At level 1, GB received 10 yuan in choices each day and needed 1 million shock points for advancement. Higher levels promised 100 yuan, 1,000 yuan, and even larger selections containing rewards far beyond ordinary money. That rule gave GB a second objective: survive the attention while creating enough genuine shock to unlock better options. The following morning, his school hung an enormous banner outside its rusty gate, celebrating the impossible city champion. Parents stopped in the street, students photographed the sign, and passersby stared at the crumbling campus in disbelief. Everyone knew the institution's normal record, which made a provincial top scorer emerging from it feel almost absurd. Some classmates remembered GBY finishing tests early and ranking near the bottom, while others decided he had hidden genius. GB woke late enough to miss most of that spectacle and immediately received the system's second daily selection. This time, the menu offered mastery of high school mathematics, physics, chemistry, plus unrelated practical and entertainment skills. GB complained that the academic rewards had arrived after the entrance exam, when he had needed them 3 years earlier. Then he recognized the danger of entering Peking University with a prestigious score but no matching knowledge. Any real professor could expose him within minutes if he could not understand material his transcript claimed he had mastered. He therefore purchased mathematics, physics, chemistry, and a complete song remembered from his previous world. The knowledge did not feel like memorized answers. Formulas, theorems, and problem-solving methods settled into a coherent framework. For the first time, GB could look at advanced high school material and understand why each step worked. The song reward also restored a piece of his lost former life, giving the victory an unexpectedly personal meaning. He made breakfast, rode his rattling second-hand bicycle towards school, and nearly crashed when he saw the giant banner. Li Mei grabbed him at the gate and dragged him inside before reporters or curious students could surround him. Teachers who once criticized his sleeping suddenly claimed they had always recognized unusual talent beneath the bad habits. GB understood their sudden warmth, because a city champion meant bonuses, recognition, and prestige for everyone connected to him. The principal served him tea and carefully asked how a student scoring near 300 could reach 760. G gave no useful explanation, because the true answer involved a system nobody else could see or verify. The principal quickly decided that questioning the miracle mattered less than making sure the miracle associated with his school. At the school assembly, thousands of students waited for the famous top scorer to deliver the usual motivational speech. GB instead told them that young people hated being lectured, so his study advice was not to give young people advice. Students erupted because someone their own age had finally said on stage what they normally whispered after adult speeches. The principal endured the joke because GB had become the most valuable student the campus has ever produced. Rather than lecture about studying, GB picked up a dusty guitar and performed the song restored by the system. Nobody recognized the melody, yet its restless lyrics about youth wandering and lost dreams immediately captured the field. Students recorded him. Teachers listened in silence, and Li Mei became emotional hearing a side of GBI nobody expected. Another wave of shock points arrived as the school realized its academic miracle could also sing and play guitar. Videos of the performance spread online, together with photographs of the banner and screenshots of the provincial ranking. For a few hours, GB looked like the perfect late-blooming genius, rising from one of the city's weakest schools. Then viewers began asking the obvious question. Nobody at the celebration wanted to answer. What had his earlier scores looked like? A photograph of the latest mock examination appeared online with GBI's name, class, and humiliating subject results clearly. His mathematics score was 47, Chinese 58, English 62, and the science combination only 145. The total stood around 312, making the leap to 716 almost impossible to explain naturally. Supporters who had defended him as a hidden genius suddenly had much less to say when confronted with those numbers. Critics argued that a true mathematical prodigy would not remain invisible through years of ordinary school testing. Within hours, the national conversation shifted from inspirational success story to possible entrance exam scandal. 2 new trending topics accused GBI of fraud and demanded an explanation for the enormous mock exam gap. The Provincial Education Bureau could not ignore the pressure and announced a formal investigation into his examination process. Once a major state newspaper repeated the announcement, surveillance footage, answer sheets, and scoring procedures became national entertainment. Investigators checked GBI's identity, handwriting, examination room recordings, seating arrangements, and every obvious route for cheating. They also confirmed the embarrassing mock scores were genuine, making the contradiction even stranger rather than eliminating it. Nothing connected Jibai to a powerful family, bribed official, leaked paper, electronic device, or organized cheating network. The investigation ultimately concluded that his 716 score involved no examination violation whatsoever. Officials publicly asked people to stop spreading unsupported accusations and respect the fairness of the result. Sympathy surged when viewers learned GB was an orphan with no wealthy family capable of engineering such a scheme. Many critics deleted comments, but academics remained unconvinced because legal innocence did not explain impossible learning speed. A mathematics graduate student argued that jumping from 47 to perfection required rebuilding an entire knowledge system. A physics professor pointed to the examination's final induction problem, which only a tiny number of candidates had solved. Admissions specialists added that practice scores normally tracked final performance closely enough to make GBI's jump statistically extraordinary. Their concern was not that surveillance had missed cheating, but that the academic transformation itself seemed incompatible with normal learning. Online supporters interpreted those doubts as elitist gatekeeping by experts unable to accept talent emerging from a poor school. The argument grew until a group of academics offered money if GBY could publicly explain the hardest questions he supposedly solved. The challenge reached 300,000 yuan and came from professionals confident the teenager would expose himself under questioning. G saw the offer, thought about his newly purchased subject mastery, and recognized the cleanest possible way to answer everyone. He called the principal and accepted a live auditorium challenge for that same evening, open to the entire internet. The public challenge grew larger. Once viewers realized the academics were willing to attach real money and professional reputations to their accusation. Some challengers promised individual payments, while one especially loud participant accepted an embarrassing physical punishment if GBI proved them wrong. Huang's group arrived from several cities rather than one department, giving the confrontation the appearance of a coordinated academic inspection. Their credentials ranged from university lecturers to doctoral advisors, making school number 99's worn auditorium feel almost comically inadequate. The school's teachers nevertheless refused to retreat, partly from loyalty, and partly because GBY's verified exam result had already survived official investigation. Before entering the hall, Huang introduced himself formally enough that the principal briefly lost the confidence he had shown online. GB answered with casual politeness, refusing to let an impressive title decide the outcome before anyone touched the chalk. A quiet specialist in the rear communicated subtly with Huang, confirming GB's suspicion that the visiting group had prepared backup questions. Li Mei walked beside GBI through peeling corridors and asked whether he truly understood the risk of challenging university experts live. His relaxed joking convinced her that panic had not replaced the confidence he showed when accepting the wager. Inside, the first mathematics board displayed the final calculus problem that had separated the province's strongest candidates from everyone else. GB began by identifying the structure of the problem, rather than copying the route used on his original examination paper. When Huang interrupted, GB explained the alternate method and showed that the same conclusion followed from a different chain of reasoning. That flexibility immediately weakened the accusation that somebody had simply provided him with an answer key after the exam. The physics board focused on electromagnetic induction, where signs, directions, and changing fields made careless memorization especially dangerous. Jibai tracked the physical relationships verbally while writing, letting viewers see how each equation corresponded to the actual mechanism. A physics professor who had doubted him online stopped commenting after the explanation reached the hardest transition without hesitation. The chemistry round used an organic synthesis pathway in which one mistaken reaction condition would destroy the entire chain. GB identified the functional group changes in order and explained why competing routes would fail under the stated conditions. By the time the 3 examination subjects were finished, the visitors had lost their strongest argument about subsect-specific memorization. Huang therefore allowed the confrontation to move beyond the official exam and into mathematics designed for elite competition students. The new inequality looked innocent enough on the board, but the visiting specialist expected several hidden traps to consume GBI's time. Instead of manipulating terms blindly, GBI created an auxiliary function that converted the statement into something easier to analyze. He proved the relevant sequence decreased monotonically and established the limit needed for the final comparison. The Lagrange mean value theorem then collapsed the remaining gap, producing a route the challenger has not expected him to know. Students watching the stream could not follow every symbol, but the visiting expert's expressions communicated the result more clearly than commentary. The former Olympiad competitor on Huang's side stopped smiling and reread the board from the first line. GB's own math teacher looked even more stunned because this technique had never appeared in anything the boy submitted at school. When GB announced the inequality held for every positive integer, nobody on the visit's side immediately offered a correction. The principal understood that silence and began celebrating before the online chat had even finished processing the answer. Viewers demanded the promised payments, while the participant tied to the physical punishment bet tried to disappear behind colleagues. Huang's attempted to close the evening by congratulating GB and citing travel schedules, hoping a dignified retreat might still be possible. GB rejected that exit because the challengers had publicly treated his entire academic identity as fraudulent. Not merely questioned one solution. He asked whether experts confident enough to accuse him nationally had truly brought nothing beyond high school and Olympiad exercises. The challenge forced Huang to reveal the deeper test his group had kept in reserve for exactly this possibility. Once advanced number theory material appeared, GB realized the visitors had given him a better opportunity than the original wager. A school-level victory could silence social media for a day, but serious research mathematics could transform his position permanently. He also saw the system's shock counter rising much faster as professional mathematicians began reacting instead of ordinary spectators. That difference confirmed that informed astonishment carried enormous value for the system's progression. G therefore stopped thinking about the wager as the main prize and treated the remaining auditorium time as an investment in future system upgrades. His choice changed the pace of the night from rapid problem-solving to a sustained attempt at original mathematical construction. Huang initially believed the teenager was overreaching, because turning a public defense into an unsolved conjecture attempt seemed self-destructive. The first boards looked dense enough that casual viewers assumed GBI was simply burying the visitors under notation. Professional mathematicians recognized organization beneath the density and started messaging colleagues before the construction was even halfway complete. Screenshots traveled through private research groups faster than the public stream could explain what GBI was attempting. Every new expert who joined increased the chance of discovering a flaw, but also increased the value of surviving the scrutiny. School number 99's internet connection struggled under a tension it had never been designed to handle. Administrators scrambled to keep the broadcast stable while teachers carried extension cables, cameras, and spare equipment toward the auditorium. The night had started as a credibility test for one suspicious top scorer and was becoming an emergency research seminar with a national audience. Yep, I welcomed that transformation, because the harder the room became, the more valuable a correct answer would be. The school's official account announced GBI's acceptance, and millions treated the event like a public trial with prize money attached. Some viewers expected a miracle, while others wanted to watch an arrogant fraud collapse in front of actual specialists. The academics responded by posting travel tickets from several major cities, making it clear they intended to confront him personally. By early evening, school number 99's tiny account had transformed into one of the busiest live streams in the country. The principal looked delighted by the attention, but still warned GB that professionals could manipulate questions to make him stumble. GB remained relaxed because the knowledge in his head no longer depended on memorizing a few examination solutions. The visiting group arrived led by Huang Mingyuan, an associate mathematics department head from prestigious Jindan University. His title alone intimidated the local staff, but GB noticed that Huang's confidence concealed real concern about public humiliation. Several challengers carried doctorates, university appointments, Olympiad backgrounds, and years of research experience far beyond ordinary high school teachers. Their plan was simple: make GBI reconstruct difficult solutions live, then probe each step until the supposed fraud broke. The auditorium stage had movable blackboards displaying the year's toughest problems from mathematics, physics, and chemistry. Teachers stood on one side, and the visiting academics on the other, giving the empty hall the atmosphere of a duel. Hundreds of thousands watched online, as Huang began with a problem that most students had failed during the real exam. Jibai did not recite his answer sheet. He rebuilt the reasoning from first principles and explained why each transformation was valid. The speed immediately unsettled the visitors because his notation looked natural, rather than rehearsed for one memorized performance. When they challenged a step, GB answered the objection directly and continued without searching for an escape route. The hardest mathematics question from the provincial examination fell in front of everyone else who kids called his score impossible. That proof alone answered the title-sized question hanging over the broadcast. The supposed loser actually understood the mathematics. The challengers moved to physics, hoping a different subject would reveal that he had only prepared for mathematics. GB reconstructed the electromagnetic induction solution, linked the relevant laws, and explained the reasoning behind the final calculation. His former physics teacher stared, because this was not the boy who had once struggled to stay awake in class. Chemistry followed, including the difficult organic synthesis sequence that had eliminated many otherwise strong candidates. Again, GB explained the mechanism and route, instead of merely presenting a final answer that could have been memorized. The visitors now faced a problem. Every subject they used as a trap strengthened the case that his knowledge was genuine. Rather than concede, they escalated beyond the actual entrance exam into material no ordinary high school student was expected to solve. Their mathematics specialist selected an Olympiad-level inequality designed to test whether GBY could think outside standardized examination patterns. A former Olympiad champion watched closely, expecting advanced notation to finally expose the limit of GBI's recently acquired mastery. GBC studied the board briefly, constructed an auxiliary function, and transformed the sequence into a form he could control. He established monotonic behavior, identified the limiting structure, and used the Lagrange mean value theorem to finish cleanly. The entire solution took only minutes, turning a supposed trap into the strongest demonstration of the night. Huang's group went pale because the teenager had used university-level tools, none of them expected from a weak school graduate. GB finished by stating that the original inequality held for every positive integer, then calmly placed down the chalk. Silence lasted only a moment before the school side erupted, releasing hours of anger, embarrassment, and accumulated fear. Li Mei cried, the principal celebrated, and viewers flooded the stream with messages demanding that the challengers honor their wager. System notifications accelerated as hundreds of thousands of people revised their opinion of GBY at the same time. The academics who had arrived expecting an easy exposure suddenly began drifting toward the exit before the confrontation grew worse. The principal positioned himself near the doorway and politely invited them to stay, clearly enjoying their discomfort. Huang promised the wager would be paid and tried to leave with whatever professional dignity remained. Jibai stopped them because he had noticed something during the walk into the auditorium that the crowd had missed. One quiet member of the visiting group had exchanged a subtle signal with Huang before the challenge began. GB suspected they had brought an additional mathematical weapon, in case the examination questions proved insufficient. He asked whether experts who had crossed the country to judge him truly had nothing more difficult prepared. That provocation struck Huang directly, because retreat now would look like admitting the specialists had exhausted their knowledge first. A harder problem appeared, and the mood shifted from checking an entrance exam score to testing the ceiling of GB's mathematical ability. GB welcomed the escalation because every additional audience reaction meant more shock points for the system upgrade he desperately wanted. Instead of solving one narrow exercise, he began building a broader framework across blackboard after blackboard. The visitors initially mocked the scale, believing the teenager had wandered away from the original task into meaningless complexity. Then, Huang recognized the structure of a famous unsolved number theory problem and ordered his own people to stop laughing. GB was no longer answering a university challenge. He had started constructing a proof of the Goldbox conjecture. The statement spread through the live chat so quickly that mathematics students began calling professors and research advisors at home. GB covered the first board with a modified circle method framework that redistributed the original problem into manageable analytic pieces. On the next board, he reorganized exponential sums according to prime factor distribution, rather than following the standard classroom route. A third board coupled another weighting method to the circle framework through a variant unfamiliar to the watching academics. Specialists stopped treating the stream as entertainment and began taking screenshots because the construction might contain genuinely new mathematics. As GB continued, every board served a different purpose, instead of repeating decorative calculations for the audience. The error terms remained controlled tightly enough that experts watching remotely could not dismiss the approach as amateur hand-waving. Huang contacted senior mathematicians, and soon a video call filled with some of the largest names in Chinese mathematics. Academician Wang joined after being told that a high school graduate was attempting the gold box conjecture. Live from school number 99, Dean Lin and other specialists initially assumed someone had exaggerated an Olympiad performance into an internet joke. Their expressions changed when they saw multiple blackboards containing a coherent number theory framework, rather than random advanced symbols. The senior mathematicians examined GBIYs, auxiliary construction, weighting functions, prime distribution, and error bounds as carefully as the stream allowed. Every step they could verify connected logically to the next, forcing them to take the teenager's attempt seriously. By the sixth board, the experts were discussing elegance, instead of asking whether GBI knew what his notation meant. By the ninth, even the video call had grown quiet, because the architecture of the proof still had not collapsed. GBI finally paused, and viewers assumed the impossible problem had reached the point where his inspiration ran out. The principal approached gently, telling him there was no need to rush because what he had already shown was extraordinary. GB turned around and explained the real problem. Every available blackboard was full, and he needed 10 more. School staff immediately ran through classrooms, removing boards from walls, suddenly convinced their campus might enter mathematical history overnight. The absurd sight became another viral moment, but the academics cared only about whether the proof could actually close. Fresh boards arrived, and GB resumed without needing to reconstruct where he had stopped or review earlier lines. Academician Wang spoke to him directly, identifying himself and asking whether GB truly believed the full argument was already complete. GB answered with the confidence of someone following a finished path rather than searching blindly for the next step. The system's purchased mathematics mastery had opened the door, but the evolving challenge was now producing knowledge beyond normal school material. GB kept writing while the number of viewers climbed, drawing researchers who had ignored the original entrance exam controversy. National attention shifted from whether one student cheated to whether that student was proving a historic conjecture in real time. Every new board created more shock points because each specialist who understood the mathematics reacted more strongly than casual viewers. The final structure connected the earlier analytic machinery to the target statement without leaving the obvious gaps critics expected. Senior mathematicians began checking critical transitions independently rather than waiting for GB to explain them a second time. When the closing line appeared, nobody in the auditorium immediately celebrated because the claim was too large for a casual reaction. Academician Wang and the remote experts instead reviewed the argument's internal logic before allowing themselves to speak. Their preliminary judgment was that the approach was sound enough to demand formal verification by the wider mathematical community. That was not the same as instantly certifying a century-scale theorem, but it destroyed the idea that GBY was an academic fraud. Huang's original challenge had accidentally provided the stage on which his target became a national mathematical phenomenon. The live audience watched professional skeptics transform into people asking GB technical questions with genuine respect. GB had entered the room, needing only to justify a suspicious exam score, and left it associated with a global research problem. Reporters surrounded the school, city officials arrived, and administrators, who rarely visited, suddenly wanted photographs beside the old blackboards. One interviewer asked how a campus with such poor historical results could produce someone capable of work at this level. GB answered through an old classical essay about a great horse whose talent remains unseen when ignorant handlers cannot recognize it. The metaphor let him criticize everyone who had dismissed him without using a direct insult or defensive rant. Viewers who understood the reference immediately translated the message for everyone else. The horse existed, but the judges had failed. After hours of writing, GB was physically drained enough that officials began treating him less like a viral student and more like protected talent. He still climbed onto the same rattling bicycle when the event ended, confusing people who expected a newly famous genius to leave in luxury. A city official offered an official car, but GB refused because he worried someone might steal the bicycle overnight. The principal joked that nobody would steal something that broken, and GBI's reply exposed that he had originally found it abandoned himself. The ridiculous exchange softened the night without changing the real consequence. His mathematical status had changed permanently. Chinese mathematicians now faced the difficult process of verifying the gold box work and obtaining recognition beyond the country's borders. Their excitement quickly collided with a problem larger than GBI's school, because international institutions controlled the field's most prestigious platforms. The International Mathematical Union did not rush to China after the announcement the way local experts hoped. Instead, its leadership indicated that GBY could present at their upcoming International Congress in America if he wanted global recognition. For senior Chinese scholars, the message sounded less like an invitation than a demand that the teenager travel overseas and ask to be acknowledged. As the gold box attempt deepened, GB reorganized exponential sums according to prime factor behavior, rather than following the most familiar textbook decomposition. Once auxiliary weighting function connected two methods that the watching specialist usually treated separately, which several researchers leaned toward their screens. A remote graduate student could only follow part of the derivation, yet every section within his expertise remained internally consistent. Academician Wang received increasingly urgent calls because younger colleagues refused to believe a high school graduate was building this framework live. He joined the video conference expecting to identify a misunderstanding with minutes and instead found 9 boards of serious number theory. Dean Lin arrived with similar skepticism and immediately began checking the error estimates rather than asking about GB's age. Other department heads were awakened or pulled away from evening plans as word spread through China's mathematical community. The experts divided the proof informally, each focusing on the section closest to their own research rather than duplicating one another's work. That distributed scrutiny made it harder for a beautiful but false argument to survive unnoticed inside the long derivation. Gibi continued writing without access to their private discussion, so his route could not adapt itself to hide from weaknesses they were discovering. By the time 10 boards were full, the school's original challenge seemed almost irrelevant, compared with what the remote experts were checking. When GB stopped, several professors assumed he had reached an obstruction that finally exceeded the system-enhanced knowledge he possessed. Teachers lowered their voices, and even triumphant online supporters prepared themselves for an honorable failure after an extraordinary attempt. GBI's request for more blackboards transformed that concern into chaos, with staff literally removing boards from ordinary classrooms. The principal ordered people to move faster because he understood that preserving GBI's train of thought mattered more than tomorrow's lesson schedule. New boards arrived from different rooms with mismatched frames, colors, and surfaces, giving the stage the appearance of a mathematical barricade. Gibi resumed at the exact point where he had paused, confirming that the delay had been physical rather than intellectual. Academician Wang began asking targeted questions through the video call, testing whether GBI understood the global architecture behind individual formulas. Gibi answered without becoming defensive, sometimes pointing to an earlier board, and sometimes deriving a missing connection on a fresh section. The senior scholars gradually stopped referring to him as a suspicious schoolboy and began speaking to him as the author of the argument. A local reporter who understood almost none of the mathematics noticed the change in honorifics before understanding why it mattered. The final boards tightened the remaining error terms and closed the gap between the analytic estimates and the target gold box statement. When the chain ended, the experts did not certify it. As a result, this important required careful independent review. They did agree that the proof possessed enough substance to deserve formal verification at the highest level. That preliminary conclusion immediately killed the simplest fraud narrative because no copied exam answer could explain the research appearing on 20 boards. Reporters pressed GBY for a story about overcoming adversity, but he refused to give them a sentimental explanation designed for easy headlines. When asked why his talent had remained invisible at a weak school, he answered with the classical image of a magnificent horse, misjudged by poor handlers. The quotation let educated viewers understand his accusation, while forcing less familiar audiences to ask others what the old essay meant. Once explained, the metaphor spread because it attacked the judgment of critics, without claiming that Jibui himself had never wasted time or made mistakes. City officials surrounded him after the event, partly to congratulate him, and partly because nobody wanted the exhausted teenager collapsing unnoticed. The contrast between official attention and GB's transportation became ridiculous when he walked past, waiting cars toward his battered bicycle. A city theater offered him a ride, genuinely worried about sending the new mathematical celebrity home alone after midnight. GB refused at first because leaving the bicycle overnight seemed like an unnecessary invitation for theft. The principal laughed that no thief would voluntarily choose something in such poor condition. GB's reply that he had originally found the bicycle abandoned made the entire group realize the joke was technically correct. That small exchange spread online alongside screenshots of the blackboards, keeping GBI's poverty visible, without turning it into a rehearsed inspirational speech. The next problem arrived from the international academic structure, rather than the internet or school number 99. Chinese experts contacted the International Mathematical Union, expecting urgent interest in a possible gold box breakthrough. The response instead emphasized the upcoming Congress in America and suggested GB could present there for formal international attention. Academician Wang interpreted the tone through decades of experience and heard a familiar message. Major Chinese work still had to travel outward for recognition. He remembered Western breakthroughs, receiving rapid engagement, while Chinese researchers were often expected to prove themselves on someone else's schedule. Dean Lin reacted emotionally because the mathematics had been examined by respected domestic scholars and still seemed treated as provincial until blessed abroad. The older mathematicians nevertheless understood that journals, prizes, and global collaboration still depended partly on institutions they disliked. They considered sending GBI to America not because the mathematics required it, but because the existing academic system made refusal costly. At Union headquarters, Charles believed that dependence guaranteed victory and treated Chinese anger as temporary theater. He expected the scholars to cool down, persuade the teenager, and arrive at the Congress grateful for an international platform. One colleague dismissed the live blackboard work as little more than dramatic scribblings from an untested child. Their confidence rested on institutional habit rather than a technical refutation of the proof itself. That distinction mattered to GBI because equations could be challenged directly, while prestige could only be challenged by making the institution need him. This and his next mathematical choices soon gave him exactly the tools required to test that idea. Academician Wang understood the insult because Western breakthroughs were often examined quickly, while this Chinese result was being told to wait. Lin hated the double standard. Yet both men knew formal international recognition still influenced journals, conferences, and academic reputation. They prepared to ask GB to attend the Congress, believing one uncomfortable trip might be the practical price of acceptance. At the Union headquarters, Secretary General Charles viewed the situation very differently and expected the Chinese side to surrender eventually. He believed China wanted the institution's approval more than the institution needed one extraordinary teenager from a poor school. Some colleagues even joked about the blackboard proof, treating GBI as entertainment rather than a researcher who could shift the field. GBI slept through most of the institutional argument and woke to another important system notification instead. The previous night's nationwide shock had pushed his accumulated points past the first upgrade requirement of 1 million. Level 2 expanded his daily allowance from 10 yuan to 100, multiplying the scale of possible rewards immediately. The new tier also confirmed that the system grew by converting public astonishment into access to increasingly valuable knowledge and abilities. GBI understood the incentive clearly. Every impossible achievement could finance the next one, provided he survived the attention it created. When the scholars explained that international officials expected him to travel to America, GB refused to behave like recognition was charity. He posted that he was not going, turning what the mathematicians saw as delicate diplomacy into another national controversy. Supporters celebrate his refusal as pride, while worried academics feared that angering the union could isolate his work internationally. GB did not spend hours arguing online, because the new system tier gave him a much stronger way to answer. He published a proof concerning the hailstone problem, another deceptively simple conjecture that had resisted mathematicians for decades. The problem could be explained to a child. Repeatedly divide even numbers by 2 and transform odd numbers by a simple rule. The difficult part was proving that every positive starting value eventually reached the same terminal cycle. Even world-class researchers had only partial results, so a complete proof appearing from the same teenager immediately drew expert attention. A university professor reviewing the upload admitted that some sections exceeded his specialty, but the pieces he understood contained no obvious flaw. GB's apartment soon filled with academician Wang, Dean Lin, Li Mei, the principal and local officials trying again to discuss America. He barely acknowledged the persuasions because he was already working on another mathematical document at his computer. The visitors initially thought he was being disrespectful until the senior mathematicians looked closely at what appeared on the screen. Their frustration vanished as they realized GBI was constructing another research-level proof instead of writing an angry social media response. Once he finished, the apartment became silent because nobody expected a second major conjecture to appear so quickly after Goldbox. GB released the document publicly rather than using it as leverage in a private negotiation with the union. International mathematicians began downloading both proofs, and comments shifted from dismissing him to asking how one teenager worked this fast. The strongest foreign researchers did not immediately endorse everything, but enough verified sections independently to keep the momentum growing. GB recognized that producing isolated answers from the system would never be as valuable as owning the talent to generate mathematics himself. The next 100 yuan selection included Gauss's mathematical talent, alongside several complete conjecture proofs and unrelated advanced rewards. One option could have given him the Riemann hypothesis outright, a result capable of detonating the entire mathematical world. GB resisted the temptation because a single finished proof was a fish, while Gauss's talent was the ability to keep fishing forever. He spent most of the allowance on Gauss mathematical talent and used the remainder on twin prime and Picari proof packages. The transfer hit far harder than the earlier high school subject mastery and overloaded his mind almost immediately. GB lost consciousness in his apartment before he could explain what had happened to anyone waiting outside. When repeated knocks and phone calls received no response, Li Mei panicked, and the senior scholars ordered the door forced open. They found him collapsed beside the computer and rushed him to a hospital before anyone understood the system had caused the episode. News that the country's newest mathematical sensation had fallen into a coma spread faster than the original exam scandal. Supporters who had spent days debating his attitude suddenly posted prayers, apologies, and messages begging him to wake up. Even many critics stopped attacking a teenager lying unconscious after producing work they had struggled to comprehend. Doctors could find no obvious catastrophic injury, but the uncertainty surrounding his condition terrified everyone responsible for protecting him. When GB finally woke, the first clear sensation was that mathematics no longer existed as disconnected techniques inside his memory. Gauss's talent had reorganized his thinking around structure, proof, deduction, and the hidden relationships between seemingly unrelated problems. He could now see routes that his earlier purchased school mastery would never have revealed on its own. GB checked his ancient phone and discovered an ocean of messages from strangers following every update about his condition. One supporter had promised to trade 10 years of life if GB woke, and GB jokingly replied that the offer had been received. The internet celebrated his recovery and immediately began teasing the unfortunate commenter for making a bargain they could not take back. Huang Mingyuan arrived carrying an expensive new computer, a peace offering after the disastrous public challenge. He apologized for helping treat GBY like a fraud and understood that the student's academic position could soon eclipse his own. GB accepted the apology but reminded Huang that the 600,000 yuan wager from the expanded challenge still had to be paid. Huang promised every last yuan would arrive, relieved that money was a simpler problem than repairing professional hostility. Li Mei brought food and remained openly cold toward Huang because she had not forgotten how aggressively the academics treated her student. Her protectiveness became another source of internet gossip, when photographs made ordinary teacher concern look far more dramatic than reality. GB ignored the speculation and returned to the larger question of forcing the international establishment to treat Chinese mathematics seriously. Two world-class proofs had already shaken experts, yet the union still expected him to appear on its stage rather than visit his. Academician Wang admitted that even widespread praise did not mean foreign leaders planned to travel to China for verification. GB answered by releasing yet another major proof, making his productivity look less like a lucky burst and more like a new era. The pattern finally became impossible for serious mathematicians to ignore. Every time the establishment delayed, GBI produced another problem it could not dismiss. Researchers, who had previously stayed neutral, began declaring that they wanted to examine the work in person, wherever GB presented it. Several Fields Medal winners publicly discussed the proofs, creating pressure the union could no longer contain through silence. Chinese users compared the situation to an old court, watching a new emperor rise and realizing late that refusing to bow carried consequences. Academician Wang disliked the dramatic metaphor, but understood the practical truth beneath it. Scholarly attention was already moving toward Jibai. The union's official account, filled with demands for a response from mathematicians and ordinary viewers around the world. Charles now had to choose between continuing to dismiss the teenager and risking the institution looking irrelevant to history, unfolding elsewhere. Instead of conceding immediately, the leadership tried to preserve authority by offering formal praise without surrendering control of the venue. They still wanted Jibai at the International Congress, where their schedule, procedures, and prestige would frame the verification. GBI's refusal turned that procedural preference into a public contest over who actually needed whom more. He continued studying the new Gauss talent and found that unfamiliar mathematics no longer felt like separate territories guarded by specialists. Number theory, analysis, and topology appeared as different languages describing structures he could increasingly translate between. That mental change mattered more than any downloaded answer, because it meant future challenges could produce original work, instead of rehearsed solutions. Senior scholars visiting him began noticing that GB could answer technical questions, extending beyond the exact material he had already published. Each conversation reduced the possibility that he had somehow copied hidden manuscripts or memorized work produced by someone else. His age remained shocking, but the real problem for skeptics became the consistency of the mathematical reasoning behind every new result. GB also understood the system's economic logic better now, because famous breakthroughs generated vastly more shock points than school-level surprises. The more impossible the achievement looked to an informed audience, the faster the next upgrade became reachable. That created a dangerous positive feedback loop. Stronger rewards enabled bigger achievements, which attracted attention capable of buying stronger rewards. Jibai wanted the benefits without becoming dependent on empty spectacle, so he focused on problems whose solutions had genuine mathematical value. The scholars around him cared less about his system incentives and more about the sudden opportunity to pull global attention toward Chinese research. They began planning a domestic verification conference that could gather specialists rather than simply waiting for the union's American Congress. Their challenge was convincing enough foreign experts to attend for the event to carry undeniable international weight. GB solved that recruitment problem indirectly by continuing to make the mathematical stakes too large for serious researchers to ignore. Invitations that once might have been dismissed now contained multiple conjecture proofs from the same 18-year-old author. Foreign mathematicians who doubted one paper could tell themselves it was coincidence, but several independent breakthroughs demanded first-hand examination. Some began booking flights before the union had even announced what its own leadership intended to do. Others publicly stated that verification mattered more than institutional politics and that they would travel wherever the mathematics required. Charles watched control slip away because the union's prestige depended on gathering the world's best mathematicians, not merely owning a famous acronym. If those mathematicians moved first, could either follow them or hold a prestigious conference, missing the event everyone wanted to see. GB had never planned a geopolitical strategy when he bought the first 10 yuan reward. Yet his system-driven rise now produced one anyway. School number 99, once mocked as a failed campus, became permanently attached to the origin story of the mathematical upheaval. The principal happily accepted reporters, officials, and scholars who previously would never have noticed the school existed. Li Mei remained more concerned with GBI's health, repeatedly reminding everyone that the person at the center was still a teenager. Ji appreciated the concern, but refused to retreat after seeing how quickly the establishment changed behavior when presented with undeniable results. He did not want a ceremonial invitation to America after being dismissed. He wanted the people who doubted work to come verify it themselves. The growing list of international researchers prepared to do exactly that, creating pressure from below the institutional leadership. Every new public commitment made Charles's original assumption weaker. China no longer looked like the only side desperate for recognition. The world's leading mathematicians were becoming desperate not to miss the verification of several historic claims happening at once. GB returned home from the hospital with better equipment, stronger mathematical talent, and more attention than he had possessed before collapsing. The orphan who once counted coins for noodles now had academics waiting outside his apartment for the chance to discuss his equations. Yet, none of that resolved the core confrontation, because the Union still tried to decide where and when the world would judge his work. GB's next moves would determine whether the old institution kept control of the stage or had to bring that stage to him. Level 2 changed the system menu so dramatically that GB finally understood why 1 million shock points had been such a demanding threshold. Rewards that once offered school subjects and modest cash were replaced by research talents, theorem packages, technologies, and abilities with national significance. GB compared the complete Riemann hypothesis with Gauss's talent and recognized a fundamental difference between possessing an answer and possessing a mind that could create answers. The Riemann proof could make him famous once, but Gauss's talent could influence every mathematical problem he encountered for the rest of his life. He spent 80 yuan on Gauss and used the remaining 20 on the twin prime and Picari conjecture proofs. That combination exhausted the entire daily allowance, leaving no room for comfortable luxuries or easier rewards. The neurological transfer struck before GBI could prepare, flooding him with patterns, methods, intuitions, and decades of compressed mathematical structure. His body collapsed because the system was not merely adding memorized pages. It was changing how his mind processed abstract relationships. Outside the apartment, Li Mei heard his phone ringing unanswered and became increasingly convinced something had gone wrong. Akamishin Wang tried knocking harder, then stopped treating the door as private property. Once nobody inside responded, the group forced entry and found GB unconscious near the equipment he had been using for the new proofs. Officials immediately worried that the pressure, sleeplessness, and hours of blackboard work had caused a medical crisis. Doctors connected monitors and tests while mathematicians, who normally argued about conjectures, waited helplessly in hospital corridors. The internet learned only fragments at first, which encouraged rumors ranging from exhaustion to poisoning to a mysterious brain disease. A trending topic about GBI's coma rapidly overtook discussion of the International Congress itself. Supporters who had demanded more proofs the previous day suddenly begged him to stop working and simply wake up. One dramatic commenter offered 10 years of personal lifespan in exchange for GBY's recovery, never expecting the patient to read the message later. When GB woke and jokingly accepted the offer online, the commenter immediately tried to withdraw it, while millions of people laughed. The humor reassured viewers because his normal personality appeared intact after the frightening collapse. Inside GBI's mind, however, the change was enormous and impossible for doctors to measure with ordinary scans. Gauss's gift turned mathematical deduction into something closer to instinctive architecture, where distant concepts could be organized before every calculation was written. Problems that once looked like walls now appeared to contain structural seams, indicating where pressure might open them. This did not mean every proof arrived instantly, but it changed how efficiently Guibai could decide which approaches deserved time. Huang visited the hospital carrying a top-tier Alienware computer, worth tens of thousands of yuan as an apology and practical tool. The gift reflected how completely their relationship had changed since Huang arrived at the school, expecting to expose a fraud. GB accepted the computer because serious mathematical work on his ancient device had become increasingly ridiculous. He still separated from financial obligations and asked when the enlarged 600,000 yuan challenge payment would arrive. Huang promised immediate transfer, understanding that refusing after a nationally watched wager would destroy what remained of his credibility. Li Mei returned with fried chicken and burgers, then gave Huang an icy reception that made him leave as quickly as dignity allowed. Viewers later turned photographs of teacher and student together into romantic gossip, despite the actual scene being simple concern during recovery. GB treated the trend as background noise because international researchers were still deciding whether any of his new proofs justified traveling to China. Foreign mathematicians praised the documents online, but many continued ending their comments with plans to discuss them at the American Congress. To academician Wang, those polite messages repeated the same imbalance in friendlier language. Admiration was offered, but the stage remained abroad. GB responded by publishing additional mathematics until the cost of staying away became greater than the prestige of refusing to move. The twin prime work drew one community, while the Picari argument forced specialists from a different field to pay attention as well. Researchers who could dismiss number theory as outside their expertise now had topology-related reasons to examine GB personally. The breadth of the results weakened another skeptical explanation that he had somehow inherited one's manuscript from an unknown mentor. A hidden mentor capable of all these fields would already have been one of the most important mathematicians alive. Instead, each interaction with GBI showed the same 18-year-old understanding the assumptions and consequences behind every document. Senior scholars began searching for a pattern in his releases and realized that institutional resistance seemed to trigger even larger breakthroughs. That pattern created urgency among foreign researchers who feared missing the next result by waiting for official permission. Some publicly announced their intention to travel to China if a serious verification meeting was organized. Others contacted Chinese colleagues privately about dates, venues, translation, and access to the full manuscripts. Every independent commitment reduced the union's ability to control attendance through its own conference calendar. Charles still believed the institutional brand would prevail, but his colleagues started calculating what happened if headlines simply chose another event first. The danger was not that the Congress would disappear. It was that it could continue while history happened elsewhere. Chinese mathematicians sensed that shift and accelerated preparations for a verification conference capable of handling global attendance. GB recovered quickly enough to participate, but his mentors watched his health more carefully after seeing the price of the Gauss transfer. He now possessed both the intellectual tools to escalate and direct evidence that every escalation carried physical as well as political costs. That combination made his next confrontation with the Union more deliberate than the impulsive refusal that had started the standoff. The domestic team announced a verification meeting in China, framing it as an open invitation rather than a rival institution. Foreign specialists could examine the proofs directly, question GBY in person, and publish whatever conclusions the mathematics supported. That format removed the excuse that Chinese scholars wanted praise without scrutiny, because the harshest possible scrutiny was being invited openly. Charles recognized the trap. Refusing to send anyone would now look like fear rather than procedural discipline. 3 days of breakthroughs had already created enough worldwide attention that silence from the Union became an answer of its own. The leadership finally offered to send an official verification team, but attached a condition meant to preserve control. They wanted China to postpone its conference, so the American International Congress could remain the first major global stage. Publicly, the request was described as scheduling coordination privately. The leadership worried about being overshadowed before its flagship event. Chinese organizers saw the problem immediately because delaying their own meeting would return initiative to the institution that had dismissed them. GB treated the demand with the same lack of reverence he had shown the original invitation to travel overseas. Around the same period, university enrollment and freshman requirements created an absurd new complication nobody in the international hierarchy expected. GB was still an incoming student, meaning ordinary campus obligations existed beside the fact that mathematicians worldwide were waiting for him. When discussion turned to freshman military training, Chinese internet users joked that the international conference would have to wait for push-ups. The contrast spread because it was inherently ridiculous. A teenager capable of historic proofs still had a student schedule. Foreign accounts encountered the joke without its cultural context, and some interpreted the posts as deliberate humiliation of the Union. Critics, who already resented GBI's rise, amplified the misunderstanding, turning a meme into evidence that China was mocking international academia. Charles saw an opportunity to reverse the humiliation and issued a much harder public position than the joke deserved. The Union demanded that GBI apologize for disrespecting the Congress before cooperation could continue normally. If he apologized, the institution could claim moral authority. If he refused, it could blame him for any breakdown in verification. The sudden controversy alarmed Chinese scholars who understood that a careless sentence could be used to bury months of work. Online users who had laughed at the military training joke began explaining frantically that nobody had meant it as official policy. Those explanations only encouraged foreign critics who enjoyed watching supporters retreat from the confidence of the previous days. GB refused to perform the humiliating script Charles expected because the mathematics had not become less correct after an internet joke. He separated personal pride from academic verification and made clear that experts were welcome to challenge every line of the proofs. What he would not accept was an institution turning access to scrutiny into a reward for political obediences. The dispute forced individual mathematicians to decide whether loyalty to the Union mattered more than seeing the work themselves. Several high-profile researchers chose the mathematics and began withdrawing or rearranging appearances at the American Congress. Their reason was straightforward. GBI's verification in China had become the event most likely to produce genuinely historic results. One withdrawal could be dismissed as personal preference, but dozens threatened the reputation of a Congress, held only once every 4 years. Fields Medal winners and leading specialists started coordinating travel toward China before Charles had regained control of the narrative. The Union leadership watched registration plans unravel and realized its strongest bargaining chip depended entirely on people willing to attend. A famous conference with empty seats and absent headline speakers would advertise weakness more clearly than any hostile statement. Charles abandoned the demand that China postpone the meeting and reversed direction in language designed to hide the reversal. The Union now asked the Chinese side to move verification earlier, saying mathematical urgency justified immediate international examination. It also promised a high-level delegation, including specialists capable of evaluating both number theory and topology. Everyone reading the announcement understood what had happened, even though the statement never used the word surrender. The institution that expected GB to travel abroad for recognition was now requesting faster access to his stage. Chinese viewers celebrated because the reversal represented more than personal victory for one talented student. Senior scholars who had spent careers accepting unequal treatment saw an international body change its schedule. Under pressure from Chinese mathematics, Jibai became the symbol of that reversal, although his real contribution remained the proofs forcing everyone to react. Academician Wang told him that the confrontation had restored dignity. Older scholars had learned not to expect from international institutions. He listened, but the praise did not change his practical concern that every claim still had to survive formal expert examination. His system could give advantages, yet no system notification could substitute for answering a hostile mathematician who found a genuine flaw. The upcoming conference, therefore, became more dangerous, academically, than any online argument or school stage challenge before it. Researchers from America, Britain, France, Germany, and other countries booked flights, many arriving earlier than originally planned. Charles traveled with the Union delegation because allowing subordinates to handle the crisis risked losing even more institutional authority. Academician Wang met the foreign group at the airport, where both sides exchanged polite smiles, hiding weeks of mutual resentment. Charles repeatedly mentioned the possibility of errors, carefully reminding reporters that preliminary excitement was not formal verification. Wang agreed that scrutiny was necessary and welcomed it, denying Charles any chance to portray the Chinese themselves as avoiding criticism. When Charles mentioned the American Congress again, Wang simply focused attention on the conference. Everyone had already flown to attend. The message required no argument. Whichever event gathered the world's leading mathematicians had already become the meaningful stage. GB stayed at a Beijing hotel near the Great Hall, where security and logistics suddenly treated him like a nationally important guest. The luxury felt surreal after years of cheap food and a broken bicycle, but he had little time to enjoy it. Conference staff rehearsed routes, translation systems, blackboard placement, camera coverage, and emergency procedures for the unprecedented event. GB inspected the hall and recognized that every physical detail now mattered because millions would analyze even small mistakes. International visitors arrived expecting several days of technical battle, not a celebration where GB simply read prepared proofs unchallenged. Chinese organizers wanted exactly that level of difficulty, because surviving aggressive questions would make the final conclusions much harder to dismiss. Before the conference opened, another kind of threat appeared from people who wanted access to GBI's mathematical reputation for private gain. A woman named Su Xuan approached him with an offer connected to a wealthy family and a child's supposed academic achievement. The proposal effectively asked GBI to provide mathematical work that could be attached to someone else's name or prestige. GB refused because selling authorship would destroy the credibility he had just spent weeks forcing experts to recognize. Suwan's visit also revealed that powerful people now viewed his proofs as assets capable of purchasing status beyond academia. He considered whether her clients might be dangerous, but concluded the later attacks involved more resources than her approach alone. Explained. Multiple groups had reasons to resent his rise, including people whose careers, admissions businesses, academic reputations, or institutional influence depended on old hierarchies. Less than 2 days before the conference, coordinated online attacks began appearing from major bloggers and paid comment networks. The posts avoided obvious lies at first, instead presenting carefully framed doubts about GBI's character, background, and sudden celebrity. Critics recycled the old examination score gap, implying that formal cheating clearance still did not explain how a weak student transformed overnight. Others portrayed his blunt refusal to flatter institutions as evidence that talent had arrived without basic virtue or humility. The campaign was designed to move discussion away from mathematics, where attacking him had repeatedly failed, and toward personality. GB recognized the timing and understood that the people behind it wanted controversy surrounding him before the world's cameras arrived. Academician Wang and older mentors considered intervening publicly, but ultimately decided GBI needed to learn to survive attacks himself. Their reasoning was harsh but practical. A person standing at the center of global attention could not depend on seniors silencing every critic. GB agreed, because the conference would expose him to far more dangerous pressure than hostile bloggers ever could. Instead of begging for sympathy, he began tracing inconsistencies in the narratives being used to discredit him. One attack involved privileged students using athletic certificates or manufactured accomplishments to gain educational advantages unavailable to ordinary applicants. As evidence surfaced, public anger shifted from GBI toward the systems and families, exploiting those loopholes. The smear campaign, therefore, produced the opposite result in several cases, exposing the interests of people who wanted him quiet. That did not prove every critic acted in bad faith, but it weakened the coordinated story that GBI alone represented unfairness. While the internet fought, GB returned to the Great Hall for a final walkthrough and technical rehearsal. Two senior figures, Lee and Joe, greeted him politely, but studied him with enough intensity to make their friendliness feel strategic. GB stored the impression without accusing anyone, because suspicion alone was not evidence, and the conference remained the priority. During a break, a separate incident near the building's water features suddenly pulled him away from mathematics entirely. A 4-year-old girl had wandered away from an elderly woman, whose treatment by security suggested significant social or political authority. GB heard splashing, reached the child before the situation became worse, and guided her safely away from the water. He spoke gently to the frightened girl and reminded her not to run off alone near a dangerous area. The grandmother found them after security teams had already begun a frantic search across the building. She thanked GB without turning the rescue into another public spectacle, and he returned to his own preparations. The encounter mattered later because powerful observers now had a personal reason to remember the teenager beyond newspaper headlines. More immediate danger appeared during the rehearsal when equipment around the stage behaved in ways that did not look accidental. A heavy lighting fixture nearly fell, and another setup involving the microphone presented an electrical hazard that could have seriously injured him. Security tightened immediately because two dangerous failures around the same high-profile target were too suspicious to dismiss casually. Beese understood that mathematical fame had crossed into a world where reputation, money, and political influence could create physical risk. Pure brilliance would not protect him if someone could simply arrange an accident before he reached the blackboard. That realization made the system's next daily selection far more important than another convenient academic shortcut. He wanted abilities that improved his chances of surviving the conference while still strengthening the mathematics. Everyone would challenge. When the new menu appeared, one option immediately stood above the rest: Ramanujan's extraordinary mathematical intuition. Gauss's talent gave disciplined deduction, while Ramanujan's gift promised the instinctive ability to see structures before formal proof caught up. A permanent charisma enhancement was also available, useful when every explanation had to command a hostile international hall. GB spent the day's allowance on both, deliberately choosing capability over flashy rewards unrelated to the immediate threat. By conference morning, systematic reasoning and supernatural intuition were operating together inside a mind already strengthened by the system. The Union's first compromise tried to send a delegation while asking China to delay its own verification until after the American Congress. Chinese organizers recognized that accepting the condition would preserve the old hierarchy even while pretending to reward GB's achievement. The military training joke then gave Charles a temporary escape from the mathematical argument by shifting attention toward etiquette and national pride. Foreign users who understood the joke sometimes pretended not to, because mocking Chinese supporters felt easier than answering the recent proofs. Others genuinely read the posts literally and wondered why a freshman exercise schedule was being used to insult an international institution. Chinese users rushed across platforms explaining the context, which made them appear defensive after days of celebrating GBY's refusal to travel. Charles's demand for an apology therefore arrived at the perfect moment to make the Union look offended, rather than cornered. For a brief period, senior Chinese scholars feared the entire verification plan might collapse over internet humor unrelated to mathematics. Individual foreign researchers broke the stalemate by announcing that they would attend the Chinese meeting, regardless of the Union's position. Withdrawal notices began reaching the American Congress from speakers whose names were essential to its prestige. Some mathematicians did not cancel completely, but moved presentations or changed travel, so China came first. That distinction still hurt the Union because the global press would naturally follow the event, gathering the strongest concentration of researchers. Charles watched the participant list deteriorate and realized a century-old institution could become a joke by defending a scheduling principle too stubbornly. The revised statement requested an earlier Chinese conference and promised a delegation led by top specialists, rather than lower-level observers. The language emphasized urgency and global progress, avoiding any admission that public pressure had forced the reversal. Chinese viewers did not need an admission because the sequence of statements made the institutional retreat obvious. When GB later boarded a flight to Beijing, the airline recognized him over the cabin announcement system. Passengers learned they were sharing the aircraft with a teenager associated with Goldbox, Hailstone, Twin Prime Prime, and Picari proofs. Applause moved through the cabin from economy toward the front, turning an ordinary flight into another strange consequence of mathematical fame. GB enjoyed the support, but also understood that the conference would be far less forgiving than excited to passengers. Beijing Airport filled with incoming research delegations from several countries as the verification date approached. Academician Wang met Charles with diplomatic warmth, while both men remembered the public battle that had brought them to the same terminal. GB was housed near the Great Hall, close enough that organizers could control transportation and security during rehearsals. The national security complex across the area made the location feel safer, yet the earlier online hostility convinced staff not to become complacent. Conference coordinators gave GB a gold-colored access pass and walked him through Stage E entrances, technical stations, and emergency routes. He checked blackboards, projectors, translation equipment, and microphones, because a minor failure during a live proof could become an international distraction. The approach from Su Wan occurred inside this compressed preparation window, making the attempt to purchase mathematical prestige especially reckless. Her proposal showed how quickly GB's work had become valuable to families seeking status for children and who had not produced equivalent results themselves. After he refused, the coordinated smear campaign broadened beyond one person and began using high-following accounts to manufacture apparent consensus. Paid commenters repeated similar phrases across platforms, making spontaneous outrage look larger and more uniform than it actually was. One attack tried to frame GBI's success as another example of privileged manipulation, despite the official record showing he had no family power. Investigations into unrelated athletic certificates then exposed wealthy students using questionable achievements to gain admissions advantages. Public attention shifted toward those cases because they provided actual evidence of privilege rather than speculation about GBI's exam. The people coordinating attacks lost one narrative, but continued searching for another that could damage him before the conference opened. During rehearsal, GB wandered near a quiet water feature and heard splashing before security understood a child was missing. The 4-year-old girl wore a white, puffy dress, had her hair in pigtails, and still carried a small spoon when GB reached her. He guided her away from the water and asked her name, keeping his voice calm enough that she stopped panicking. Her grandmother's arrival revealed by security behavior that the family possessed significant authority, though GB did not ask for favors. The rescue remained personal rather than transactional, giving the elderly woman a reason to remember his character outside public controversy. Later that day, a lighting fixture nearly fell in a corridor or stage area connected to his route, raising immediate security questions. A separate microphone setup presented an electrical danger, serious enough that staff stopped treating the incidents as ordinary technical mistakes. The possibility of sabotage changed conference planning from reputation management into actual protective security. GB began thinking beyond mathematics, recognizing that an enemy unable to beat the proofs might try to prevent the presenter from reaching the board. The next system menu offered futuristic technologies, physical skills, and scientific knowledge alongside mathematical talents. Artificial starch synthesis fragments and brain-computer interface blueprints tempted him because their long-term value could exceed even famous conjecture proofs. Master-level piano and combat skills offered different kinds of utility, especially after the suspicious equipment failures. GB still prioritized the immediate conference and selected Ramanujan's intuition, plus a permanent charisma enhancement. The decision paired Gauss's disciplined reasoning with a talent famous for seeing mathematical relationships before conventional derivation caught up. Charisma mattered because a correct proof could still be buried under confusion if the presenter failed to control a hostile hall. By opening morning, GB had strengthened both the substance of his answers and the way those answers would land before the world. The moment Ramanujan's intuition activated, mathematical relationships appeared to GB before he consciously traced every intermediate step. He still needed rigorous arguments, but Gauss's deduction could now build bridges toward patterns the new intuition revealed instantly. The charisma enhancement changed something subtler, making his calm confidence easier to project across a room without theatrical shouting. GB entered the Great Hall, knowing experts would attack the proofs, rivals would attack his attitude, and unknown enemies might attack him physically. The conference's audience included thousands of scholars, senior Chinese academics, international delegations, reporters, and cameras feeding a massive live stream. Charles sat among foreign leaders, expecting the teenager to finally encounter questions that could not be brushed aside by internet popularity. Joe opened with a long, deferential introduction, emphasizing foreign scholars and the international institutions represented in the room. To many Chinese viewers, the speech sounded as though the host was thanking outsiders for allowing China to hold its own conference. He disliked the posture immediately because the visitors had come to examine his work, not grant permission for it to exist. When his turn arrived, he walked past Joe's last-minute advice and took the microphone without performing the expected grateful junior routine. GB told the hall they could skip the ceremony and go directly to the gold box conjecture proof. Then he issued the simplest possible invitation. Anyone who disagreed should identify the exact mathematical point they believed was wrong. The direct challenge stunned the hall because it removed titles, institutions, and national prestige from the argument entirely. A younger foreign mathematician stood first and attacked a transition involving GBI's use of a circle method variant. Rather than defend the step with authority, GB reconstructed the missing bridge on a blackboard and showed why the objection failed. The challenger sat down after confirming the logic, and another researcher immediately targeted a different part of the proof. Each question became an opportunity to test whether GBI truly understood the full structure or merely possessed a polished manuscript. GBIs answered from different starting points, changing notation when useful, and deriving supporting claims, rather than repeating memorized phrases. That flexicility mattered because a copied proof can survive reading, but it rarely survives unpredictable interrogation by specialists. Several senior mathematicians began taking notes on GB's explanations themselves, discovering ideas extending beyond the published version. Charles watched the first session with growing frustration because every failed challenge increased the teenager's credibility worldwide. Chinese viewers celebrated the confidence, but academician Wang focused on the more important fact that hostile scrutiny kept finding no fatal gap. Hours passed as experts attacked assumptions, boundary cases, estimates, and the connections between GBY's auxiliary constructions. GB occasionally paused long enough for critics to hope they had finally reached the limit of his preparation. Those pauses usually ended with a cleaner explanation, a short derivation, or an alternative route around the disputed point. The system's combined talents made difficult questions sharpen his thinking instead of overwhelming it with unrelated details. At the close of the session, the strongest objections had been answered publicly rather than hidden behind later private review. GB declared the gold box conjecture proven, not as a victory chant, but as the conclusion he believed the evidence now supported. Formal publication would still require written examination. Yet the live challenge had changed the burden of proof for anyone calling it nonsense. The first conference day ended with foreign scholars discussing technical details instead of whether an 18-year-old belonged in the room. Day 2 moved to the hailstone problem, where the statement looked elementary, but decades of failed attempts made complete proof notoriously slippery. GB presented the argument carefully, enough that specialists could trace how local transformations connected to a global guarantee of convergence. Researchers tested unusual starting cases, questioned hidden assumptions, and looked for places where the iteration might escape the intended framework. GB answered by exposing the controlling structure rather than checking examples one at a time, keeping the proof genuinely general. The session demonstrated why the problem had fooled generations. Simple rules can hide behavior requiring deep global reasoning. Several mathematicians who came primarily for Goldbox found themselves more fascinated by the new tools emerging from the hailstone proof. GB again survived the day's questioning without a decisive mathematical contradiction, increasing pressure on Charles to acknowledge the pattern. Day 3 turned toward the twin prime conjecture, another famous number theory problem concerning prime pairs separated by 2. Specialists expected this session to expose fatigue, because GB had already spent 2 days under continuous technical attack. Instead, the teenager walked in with the same concentrate and began rebuilding the prime distribution framework needed for the argument. Questions came faster because the audience now understood that waiting politely only gave GB more time to control the presentation. One expert challenged an estimate, another questioned a limiting step, and a third attacked the interactions between 2 analytic tools. GB responded in sequence, occasionally using one objection to clarify why an earlier construction had been chosen in the first place. The strongest moment came when a question forced him beyond the prepared proof and into territory not explicitly written in his notes. Gauss's talent organized the deduction, while Ramanujan's intuition exposed a cleaner relation, producing an answer the hall had not seen before. That response convinced several remaining skeptics that GBI's ability could generate mathematics in real time rather than merely deliver stored results. By the end of day 3, another major conjecture had survived a room filled with people professionally motivated to find weaknesses. G closed the session by declaring the twin prime conjecture proven under the framework he had just defended. The statement no longer sounded like youthful arrogance to the researchers who had spent hours trying unsuccessfully to break it. Day 4 shifted from number theory into topology through the Picari problem, the hardest transition in the planned sequence. Joe's opening ceremony irritated many viewers because he used polished English and deferential praise that seemed unnecessary on Chinese home ground. GB interpreted the tone as symbolic surrender before the mathematical contest had even started and decided his own opening would be the opposite. His first sentence bypassed every ceremonial thank you and forced critics to identify an actual flaw in the Goldbox proof. A blonde mathematician accepted immediately, targeting a transition between the circle method and another analytic component. GB wrote the intermediate argument that had been compressed in the manuscript and showed why the transition preserved the estimate being challenged. The challenger checked the derivation before sitting, giving the audience its first visible example of skepticism being resolved rather than silenced. Another expert questioned the chosen weight function, arguing that a different boundary case might destroy the claimed error control. GB moved to a fresh section of board and separated the troublesome term until its contribution could be bounded independently. The room learned quickly that asking him to expand the word obviously usually produced several lines of mathematics rather than irritation. That habit made the sessions educational because compressed research arguments became fully exposed under public pressure. A few questions revealed cleaner formulations than the versions GB had originally prepared, and he adopted those improvements without pretending perfection. Tao watched the process with particular interest because improving a proof under attack and demonstrated more than defending a fixed document. By the second day, researchers stopped raising their hands merely to test the teenager and started asking questions they genuinely wanted answered. The hailstone session attracted specialists interested in dynamical behavior because the elementary rule concealed an enormous space of possible trajectories. GB showed how his framework prevented a positive starting value from escaping indefinitely through an unaccounted branch. When an audience member proposed an exceptional family of integers, GBY traced the family through the controlling argument rather than checking numerical examples. The objection, therefore, strengthened the general proof by making one implicit restriction explicit for everyone watching. On the twin prime day, several analytic number theorists coordinated questions so they could attack different sections without wasting time on duplication. One targeted distribution estimates, one challenged the interaction of sieve-like components, and another questioned the passage to arbitrarily large scales. GB answered each section with enough detail that independent groups in the audience could continue checking while the next question began. The pace resembled an oral defense, multiplied across an entire research community, rather than a normal conference lecture. Every successful answer generated new shock points. But GB could not afford to watch the counter while managing live mathematics. Ramanujan's intuition became most visible when a question pushed him toward a relation absent from the prepared notes. He saw the useful connection first, then relied on Gauss's disciplined talent to turn that flash into a defensible argument. Several experts noticed the resulting lemma could matter outside the original twin prime proof and copied it for later study. The Picard session forced a larger conceptual shift because topology required geometric language that many number theorists in the hall did not routinely use. GB slowed his exposition enough to establish the relevant manifold structure before applying the geometric flow machinery. Topology specialists interrupted more often than casual viewers expected, because intuitive pictures can hide severe technical gaps in high dimensions. Each interruption pushed GB to state assumptions more precisely, improving the public record rather than derailing the proof. A senior scholar asked why one singular behavior could be excluded, and GB answered by connecting it to the way his modified construction controlled curvature. That explanation drew several experts to the board during the break, where they inspected the exact line before the session continued. Dowsewald's relative silence became a subject of curiosity because someone of his stature could have dominated the questioning if he wanted. He explained privately that forcing questions after the essential structure looked correct would serve ego more than mathematics. Charles heard comments like that and realized the strongest foreign mathematicians were no longer behaving as an institutional opposition bloc. They had become individual researchers responding to whatever mathematical value they saw, regardless of the union's political discomfort. After 4 days, fatigue was visible across the hall, even though GB continued using systems support to maintain concentration. Some scholars had notebooks filled with more new research directions than they normally collected across an entire year of conferences. The unscheduled BSD challenge therefore emerged from genuine mathematical hunger, as well as a desire to test whether GBI's performance had any limit. Even experts who considered the question unfair leaned forward because the combination of Gauss and Ramanujan talents had already produced impossible answers repeatedly. GB's 2-minute silence became powerful precisely because the audience had grown accustomed to near-instant responses during earlier sessions. William stopped moving, recognizing that the new problem touched a region where even decades of specialist experience offered no easy route. Tao also watched without speaking, allowing GB the rare quiet necessary to build an answer, rather than turning the moment into theater. When the chalk finally moved, the first formulas indicated a route through elliptic curves and L functions, rather than a clever trick isolated to the question. Experts immediately understood that the scale of the response was expanding beyond what the challenger had actually requested. Several audience members began messaging colleagues outside the hall before GB had reached the third board. Those messages caused the global stream to surge again, as mathematicians realized the full BSD conjecture might be unfolding unexpectedly. Security staff saw crowd numbers rise outside the venue and expanded the perimeter while the proof continued indoors. Traffic around the plaza was redirected to reduce congestion and keep emergency access clear during the increasingly historic session. Inside, however, GB barely noticed the security changes because every remaining mental resource was committed to holding the growing proof together. The conference's final challenge had become the clearest test yet of whether the system could turn impossible pressure into genuine original mathematics. Many observers expected even a genius to slow down when moving into a field requiring different geometric instincts and technical machinery. GB began from the topology of high-dimensional manifolds and worked through a geometric flow framework with unusual control of the details. Instead of copying an existing historical approach, he filled missing connections and presented a cleaner construction, built around the same central ideas. Topology specialists followed aggressively, searching for hidden assumptions where elegant geometric language might conceal an impossible step. GB answered them in the field's own language, showing that his competence did not vanish when prime numbers left the board. A famous mathematician named Tao attended, quietly and rarely interrupted, which confused colleagues who expected him to test every difficult claim. When asked why he remained silent, Tao explained that there was little point in venting objections. After recognizing that the key route worked, His presence carried weight because he had nothing to gain from flattering a teenager whose rise disrupted every existing hierarchy. Charles became visibly more uncomfortable as researchers he respected stopped behaving like neutral judges and started learning from GBI's methods. By late afternoon, the Picare argument had survived the same brutal process as the three earlier conjectures. The conference had therefore produced 4 consecutive days where GBI entered with a historic claim and left after answering expert challenges. A predictable event would have ended there with applause, photographs, and formal committees, writing reports for months. Instead, one final question transformed the entire conference from extraordinary into something nobody had scheduled. A scholar presented GB with a problem tied to the BSD conjecture, one of the famous Millennium Prize problems. The challenge was not a friendly classroom exercise. Even the greatest living mathematicians recognized that answering it immediately was borderline unreasonable. Viewers compared it to climbing another extreme mountain after finishing several summits without rest. While the entire world watched, GB copied the problem onto the blackboard and stood silently for roughly 2 minutes, creating the first genuine suspense of the conference. Several people assumed the accumulated strain had finally caught up with him and prepared to accept that nobody could solve everything. GB was not frozen. He was watching a path assemble inside his head as deduction and intuition attacked the problem together. The system had described his intelligence as something that grew stronger against stronger opponents, and this challenge activated that effect completely. He began with the leading behavior of an elliptic curve's L function near the critical point and related it to arithmetic structure. From there, he connected rank, vanishing order, height information, and known machinery into a sequence the specialist could actually interrogate. GB sometimes called a transition obvious that would normally require pages, forcing experts to stop him and demand the missing derivation. Each time, he supplied the omitted argument rather than hiding behind the compressed presentation, allowing the proof to keep moving. The room's mood changed because the original question had only asked for a difficult localized result. Yet, GB kept expanding the framework. Researchers realized he was not trying merely to survive the challenge. He was moving toward the full BSD conjecture itself. That recognition spread outside the hall, and viewers who had stopped watching the predictable victories rushed back to the stream. Servers struggled as mathematicians, students, office workers, and families all tried to witness whether the claim was real. Security around the building increased because the event had become even more valuable, and the earlier sabotage remained unresolved. GB wrote through lunch while scholars ate in their seats, unwilling to miss a line that might become part of mathematical history. At one point, he quietly used a system energy potion, while everyone assumed he was simply drinking water. The potion restored physical endurance. But the hard part remained intellectual because the BSD conjecture resisted superficial pattern matching. Gauss's systematic brilliance organized the long dependencies, while Ramanujan's intuition repeatedly pointed toward the next useful construction. The permanent intelligence increase helped him hold enormous chains of definitions and implications, without losing earlier conditions. Additional system buffs improved luck and decision quality, reducing the chance that he wasted hours exploring an unproductive branch. None of those advantages eliminated the need for proof. They simply made a humanly impossible search process increasingly tractable for him. Specialists around the room checked sections independently as soon as GBI completed them, searching for contradictions before the structure became too large. No one wanted the entire hall to celebrate a beautiful argument only to discover that an early assumption had quietly failed. The most dangerous points attracted clusters of researchers whispering, calculating, and comparing notes, while GB continued several boards ahead. Every time a group thought it had found a problem, closer examination either resolved it or produced a question. GB answered publicly. Hours of writing turned the stage into a wall of mathematical notation, stretching across board after board. The physical scale reminded older scholars of the school number 99 night, when GBI first ran out of blackboard space. This time, however, the audience contained world leaders in the exact fields required to evaluate what he was doing. Their silence carried more meaning than internet applause, because many had spent career understanding precisely why BSD was difficult. As the final structure closed, the conference stopped feeling like a challenge session and became a collective attempt to verify a new theorem. GB wrote the last critical relation, checked the chain once more, and stepped away from the board without dramatic celebration. Nobody moved for several seconds because accepting the implication meant believing an 18-year-old had just crossed a Millennium Prize frontier live. Then the first senior mathematicians began confirming that the route deserved full formal verification rather than immediate rejection. GB had entered the conference defending 4 prepared conjectures and ended by answering an unscheduled challenge with something even larger. The supposed loser, who once scored 47 in math, now had the world's strongest mathematicians checking his solution instead of his school record. At roughly 3 in the afternoon, GB's chalk stopped moving before the last board, and the entire hall seemed to stop with it. He reread the final chain carefully, because one careless sign or unstated condition could ruin hours of otherwise beautiful mathematics. The nearest specialist leaned forward without speaking, trying to infer from his expression whether he had found a flaw. GB made one small correction, followed the implication to its endpoint, and wrote the conclusion linking the argument to BSD. The final period landed harder than any applause because everyone capable of understanding the board knew what the sentence claimed. For several seconds, senior mathematicians remained between intellectual verification and the emotional shock of witnessing the result live. Then the Great Hall erupted, releasing an entire day of tension in a roar that overwhelmed even the broadcast microphones. Charles sank back with the expression of someone watching an institutional strategy collapse under equations he could not negotiate away. William, a veteran researcher who had pursued BSD-related questions for more than 2 decades, openly cried while staring at the boards. The emotion was not humiliation. It was relief that a problem he feared might outlive him now had a visible route forward. Another renowned mathematician stood applauding until his palms reddened, while others simply watched in stunned silence. Academician Wang gripped his thermos so tightly that the veins in his hand rose, unable to find words for what had happened. He remembered earlier generations of Chinese scholars sitting quietly in back rows at international meetings, hoping merely to be heard. Now many of the world's strongest researchers were sitting in Beijing, afraid to miss a single line written by a Chinese teenager. The applause continued for minutes, but GB did not treat emotion as verification and raised the microphone again. He invited questions immediately, arguing that a proof performed live should be challenged while every board and every expert remained present. 7 or 8 hands rose almost at once, revealing that the hall's respect had not reduced its appetite for difficult scrutiny. Tao wanted clarification on one technical board, while another expert targeted an L-function correspondence several boards later. William practically competed to speak first because the proof touched the exact bottleneck that had consumed years of his career. GB chose William and listened as the veteran asked about an effective upper bound buried deep inside the BSD machinery. The question was not ceremonial. It attacked a point difficult enough to remain meaningful even after the main proof had closed. GB thought briefly, moved to a sideboard, and proposed decomposing the structure through the cohomology of a Shimura-type variety. He then explained how modular lifting could remove the rank restriction, blocking William's preferred route. William stared at the short derivation because the answer bypassed the obstacle rather than attacking it with the same tools he had exhausted. The veteran repeated the idea under his breath until the alternate path became clear enough that disbelief turned into excitement. He finally bowed and acknowledged that GB had not merely solved one problem, but opened another research direction for everyone following it. That admission carried unusual weight because William's own reputation gave him every incentive to challenge the teenager aggressively. Other leading mathematicians followed with questions drawn from years of unresolved work, using the conference as an opportunity to test GBI's ceiling. Some questions required short blackboard derivations, while others could be resolved by identifying one hidden relation the asker had overlooked. GB did not pretend every issue was trivial, but his answers repeatedly turned long research obstacles into cleaner structures people could pursue. The QA session therefore became more valuable than a victory lap because it generated new mathematics beyond the original BSD argument. After nearly an hour, GB asked again whether anyone had another objection or unresolved technical question about the proof. The hall fell silent, not because people lacked curiosity, but because the obvious attacks had already been exhausted publicly. 1 minute passed, then another, and no specialist stood to claim a contradiction capable of breaking the result. GB finally declared the BSD conjecture proven under the argument the hall had just examined together. The second applause sounded different from the first because it followed detailed questioning rather than the emotional shock of the final line. Tao smiled at the absurdity of witnessing a millennium-level breakthrough arrive on top of 4 already historic conference days. William continued photographing boards and writing notes, clearly thinking less about ceremonies than about the research he could now attempt. Charles could no longer plausibly describe GBI as a child whose work needed institutional validation before anyone took it seriously. The institution now needed to remain connected to the teenager because the world's mathematical attention had already moved toward him. Online reaction crossed national borders immediately, producing admiration, rivalry, disbelief, and nervous speculation about what GBI might solve next. British viewers praised the achievement while insisting their own research community would respond competitively, rather than surrender intellectually. French commenters defended William from mockery, arguing that losing to a historic breakthrough did not diminish decades of serious work. Russian users offered celebratory jokes involving vodka, while Indian commenters reminded everyone that genius could emerge anywhere with enough opportunity. Japanese discussions turned anxious over the possibility that GBI might continue attacking every remaining millennium problem in sequence. Korean internet users generated humorous ancestral claims, trying to connect his family line to ancient migration stories. The variety of reactions showed that GBI had stopped being a domestic exam celebrity and become a global cultural reference point. Inside the hall, Zhao delivered the official closing remarks with flawless composure. Despite having watched every attempt to diminish GB fail, he congratulated the teenager, praised international cooperation, and called the 5-day gathering a milestone in mathematical history. Nothing in Zhao's public expression revealed whether he resented that the conference had produced an outcome far larger than organizers expected. Outside the venue, crowds gathered behind security lines after hearing that BSD had been completed during a session that was supposed to end with Picare. Many held phones overhead, even though they could see only the building, treating proximity to the event as worth hours of waiting. Plainclothes officers moved through the crowd, while uniformed police guarded entrances and kept access routes open. Online, people who had stopped watching after 4 apparently inevitable victories returned when friends messaged that a millennium problem was being attempted live. Workplaces streamed the session on office monitors, and some supervisors watched beside employees instead of ordering them back to work. Family chat groups circulated links, faster than broadcasters, could summarize the mathematics for people arriving late. Students called roommates away from games, telling them the first 4 days no longer mattered because the unexpected 5th problem had changed everything. The streaming platform struggled under traffic spikes and repeatedly adjusted capacity to keep the Blackboard feed visible. Inside the hall, scholars skipped a formal lunch break rather than risk missing a decisive line, while GB was still building the BSD proof. Prestigious researchers in tailored suits ate simple sandwiches with one hand and wrote calculations with the other. The image became symbolic online because the hierarchy had inverted. Senior scholars were afraid to leave their seats, while a uniformed teenager kept teaching. Academician Wang watched from the side and quietly compared the scene with conferences where Chinese researchers once struggled even to obtain speaking time. He did not interrupt GB with patriotic speeches, knowing the mathematics itself communicated the reversal more powerfully than rhetoric could. When the final BSD conclusion appeared, several scholars independently photographed every board before staff could accidentally erase or rearrange anything. Teams began organizing high-resolution copies and written transcripts so formal verification could continue after the live session ended. GB invited immediate questions anyway, preventing critics from claiming the celebratory atmosphere discouraged serious examination. William's first deep objection came from the part of the argument closest to the work that had occupied much of his adult career. GB's short answer did not solve every related future problem, but it gave William a route around the barrier that had blocked his preferred approach. The veteran's bow, therefore, acknowledged both the completed proof and the opening of a new program of research. Other experts used their turns less ceremonially, asking about specific estimates, correspondences, and extensions they hoped to develop themselves. A few questions produced side results unrelated to the main theorem, turning the verification session into an impromptu workshop. Tao and several colleagues began comparing those side results before the official applause had fully ended. The event's value was no longer measured only by whether BSD was correct, but by the amount of new mathematics already growing around it. Charles saw that shift and understood why institutional control could not be restored by simply delaying publication or questioning procedure. Even if formal review took months, hundreds of experts had witnessed enough substance to keep working from GBY's ideas immediately. The union could participate in that future or watch researchers bypass it whenever bureaucracy slowed them down. International newspapers struggled to explain 5 conjectures in language ordinary readers could understand, often reducing the story to GBI's age and exam history. That simplification irritated mathematicians, but also spread the basic fact that a teenager from an obscure school had overturned expectations repeatedly. Chinese education commentators returned to the original mock exam controversy and admitted the earliest numbers now looked almost absurd beside the conference record. People who once demanded proof that GB deserved 716 were now debating whether the entrance exam had been too limited to measure him. The irony pleased students at school number 99, who remembered how quickly adults had treated their campus as incapable of producing talent. Teachers there preserved photographs of the mismatched blackboards used during the first gold box night, recognizing they had become part of the story. The principal began receiving requests from schools and media organizations wanting to visit the once-ignored campus. Li Mei cared less about institutional tourism and kept asking whether GB had eaten enough during the 5-day marathon. Her concern sounded ordinary, which helped GB remain connected to the life he had before the entire world learned his name. The 600,000 yuan wager, once a major financial goal, now looked almost trivial beside international research offers and possible prizes. Jifi still valued the money because poverty had trained him never to dismiss amounts other people considered small. That attitude separated material security from status. He could accept wealth without pretending expensive surroundings. Defined his achievement. Conference staff began dismantling technical equipment only after mathematicians confirmed every relevant board had been documented properly. Foreign delegations asked for copies of the proofs, supplementary notes, and contact channels for follow-up questions once they returned home. Several scholars wanted private research meetings during the banquet, making dinner feel like an extension of the conference rather than a celebration. The 5-day schedule had exhausted everyone, but intellectual excitement kept conversations moving through hallways and waiting areas. GB noticed that the same foreigners, once portrayed online as an opposing camp, behaved very differently when individual respect replaced institutional posturing. That distinction reinforced his decision to speak English privately with people who treated him as a colleague rather than a subordinate. He opposed deference, not communication, and saw no value in creating hostility after the mathematical dispute had been settled honestly. The banquet, therefore, began under an unusual mixture of relief, exhaustion, competition, and genuine curiosity about what GB might attempt next. Nobody at the tables believed his career could return to the normal freshman path originally attached to the Peking University acceptance letter. The remaining uncertainty concerned where he would work, which institutions would adapt around him, and whether older hierarchies could tolerate the change. Zhao's closing banquet remarks soon revealed that this last question was far from settled, even after every mathematical challenge had failed. The final conflict of the source would therefore move away from formulas and toward who was allowed to define how a young genius should behave. He announced an evening banquet in the Great Hall, following the simple tradition that guests who finish serious work should be fed properly. Williams accepted quickly because he wanted more time near Ji-Bai, not because he cared about a formal dinner. Tao and other researchers agreed as well, already discussing which technical questions could be continued away from the stage. Even Charles accepted with a restrained smile, recognizing that refusing would only isolate him further from the people shaping the next conversation. For 5 consecutive days, Ji-Bai had defended or completed 5 historic conjectures before specialists capable of understanding the stakes. That record changed how every major prize, conference, research institute, and mathematics department would evaluate the 18-year-old afterward. The upcoming International Congress could no longer pretend he was merely another young speaker hoping for a place on the program. Discussion naturally turned toward the Fields Medal, the Fields' famous award given only once every 4 years to exceptional younger mathematicians. Ji-Bai's age, productivity, and verified breakthroughs made ignoring him far more controversial than recognizing him could ever be. He did not spend the afternoon calculating prizes because the banquet and recruitment pressure were about to create a different kind of problem. When the banquet doors opened, foreign visitors stopped long enough to take in carved ceilings, crystal chandeliers, rosewood furnishings, and traditional art. The room projected a style of grandeur very different from the European palaces. Several guests knew well. William compared the atmosphere favorably with famous royal sites he had visited, while another professor connected the setting to China's long civilization. GB found the comments amusing because his own life still felt closer to cheap noodles and a broken apartment than national grandeur. At the main table, one foreign mathematician attempted to greet him in Chinese with such poor tones that the effort became endearing. GB answered in fluent English, surprising guests who had assumed his insistence on Chinese during the conference reflected limited language ability. In reality, he had chosen Chinese publicly because the event took place in China, and he disliked the host's earlier habit of flattering foreigners. Private conversation was different, so GB switched languages whenever doing so, made technical discussion easier and more respectful. The gesture pleased foreign scholars because they realized his conference posture had been deliberate rather than insecure. Tao joked about colleagues trying to learn Chinese expressions they had heard during the week, turning linguistic curiosity into another side effect of the event. Conversation quickly returned to mathematics, and GB casually mentioned two possible directions extending ideas from the BSD proof. Tao and William reacted immediately, nearly reaching for notebooks before dinner had properly begun. Their excitement demonstrated how quickly GBI's role had changed from challenged student to someone capable of setting research agendas. Then the recruitment war started, because every institution understood that whoever secured GBY could reshape its reputation for decades. Princeton's representatives offered permanent academic status, independent research infrastructure, extensive funding, and freedom from ordinary administrative work. The proposal effectively promised GB the resources of a major institution without requiring him to climb its normal career ladder. MIT countered with its own package, refusing to let a rival secure the century's most visible young mathematician uncontested. Other foreign universities joined, each emphasizing laboratories, funding, collaborators, prestige, or freedom, according to what they believed he valued. Jeppy listened politely, because only weeks earlier he had been worried about whether Peking University would accept him at all. The contrast was almost absurd. Institutions now competed to employ a teenager who had technically not even started his freshman year. Chinese organizations waited only until the foreign offers became serious before launching their own recruitment effort. Academician Wang offered GBI leadership of a national-level laboratory with staff and funding, designed around whatever research program he chose. He went further by implying that even the Academy's highest leadership could eventually become available if GBI remained and developed there. The proposal shocked the table because it treated an 18-year-old not as a promising student, but as future institutional leadership. Tsinghua University offered a full professorship and a dedicated institute, discarding the status of Crescent from undergraduate to graduate researcher. Peking University reminded everyone that the system altered admission, already made GBI its incoming student, and offered to accelerate him directly into special status. Nanjing's representative chose humor, praising campus scenery and the abundance of female students instead of pretending money alone would decide everything. Laughter broke the tension, but the competition beneath the joke remained completely real. Gibai told everyone he would decide later, because choosing under banquet table pressure made no sense after the week he had just survived. Privately, he wondered whether rejecting Peking University could somehow conflict with the system university that started his entire rise. Nothing in the system explicitly threatened him, yet the thought amused him enough to keep the original university in consideration. Viewers following banquet coverage could barely process seeing universities bid for someone their age before his official enrollment papers were settled. The recruitment spectacle also confirmed that the old fraud narrative was dead among institutions willing to risk enormous money on his future. Gibi finally had the financial security and professional options that had been unimaginable when he survived on part-time wages. Still, the people who failed to beat mathematically had not disappeared, and the banquet provided another softer way to limit his influence. Once formal conference business ended, seniority, etiquette, and social hierarchy could be used where equations offered no advantage. Zhao understood that terrain far better than a blackboard, and he prepared the closing banquet speech around exactly those themes. GB ate while listening, initially expecting routine congratulations, followed by harmless advice to rest after an exhausting week. The speech began safely enough, praising his rare talent and presenting his achievements as a source of national pride. Then, Zhao shifted from celebration toward a message about how young brilliance should behave under the guidance of experienced elders. Zhao praised GB's brilliance first, making the advice that followed sound like concern rather than an attempt to restore hierarchy. He argued that talent could make a young person move quickly, but only age and experience could keep that talent on the correct road. The speech encouraged Ji-Bai to soften his edges, listen to seniors, and remember how long older scholars had served the field. Zhao repeatedly described the message as guidance from elders who wanted nothing except the teenager's healthy development. Several senior academics nodded, because the framing gave them a comfortable role after 5 days of watching GBY outperform established experts. They no longer needed to compete with him mathematically if they could still claim authority through age, experience, and social position. Charles also appeared more relaxed, because the conversation had finally moved on to terrain, where equations could not immediately defeat him. Many younger viewers reacted differently and interpreted the speech as a polished demand that GB know his place. Online comments asked how people unable to solve his problems intended to guide him toward the mathematical future he was already creating. Others argued that wisdom and technical ability were separate, so respecting experience did not require pretending every elder understood GB Vai's path better. The discussion might have ended as ordinary banquet advice if Zhao had simply finished and left the microphone alone. Instead, after roughly 10 minutes, he invited GB onto the stage to say a few words in response. GB paused because the invitation immediately felt more dangerous than any direct mathematical question during the conference. Zhao had just spent several minutes defining the teenager as gifted but sharp-edged, brilliant but immature, successful but in need of correction. Any angry reply could now be presented as proof that the diagnosis was accurate from the beginning. If GB accepted the lecture silently, Zhao would restore the old hierarchy without needing to win a single equation. If he rejected it aggressively, critics could label him arrogant, ungrateful, and incapable of respecting senior scholars. Ji-Bai recognized the structure of the trap before reaching the microphone, yet refusing to speak would create its own damaging interpretation. Elsewhere in the city, the people behind earlier coordinated attacks watched the banquet stream with prepared accounts and editing tools. Their goal was no longer to prove GBI's mathematics false, because 5 days of open verification had made that strategy impossible. They only needed one emotional sentence that could be isolated from context and circulated as evidence of terrible character. Paid comment networks stood ready to repeat the same accusation until artificial repetition looked like spontaneous national consensus. GB took the microphone and began calmly enough that Zhao's expression remained perfectly controlled. He acknowledged that the vice chairman had raised points worth considering, preventing critics from claiming. He rejected every form of advice automatically. Then GB added that he did not fully agree with the conclusion. Zhao wanted the room to accept. The hall went silent because those few measured words opened exactly the confrontation everyone had hoped to avoid. A brief flash of satisfaction crossed Zhao's face, suggesting he believed the teenager had already stepped onto prepared ground. Older scholars frowned and waited for an impulsive defense of youthful arrogance they could condemn without discussing mathematics. The online attack teams leaned closer to their screens, ready to cut the first hostile phrase into short viral clips. GB did not shout at Zhao, insult a specific professor, or claim that older people had contributed nothing. Instead, he reached for an essay from his previous world that the system had restored to him. The piece centered on the relationship between a nation's future and the energy, imagination, and courage of its young people. GB began by separating age from authority, arguing that societies become old or young according to the spirit of the people shaping them. Those oriented entirely toward the past naturally become cautious because their priority is preserving what already exists. Young people, by contrast, tend to imagine futures that have not yet been built, and therefore accept risks preservation-minded people avoid. GB framed caution as useful for protecting inherited structures, but inadequate when the world requires rather than maintenance. He described forward-looking youth as naturally more willing to challenge boundaries because they have more future than past to defend. At the banquet tables, however, several older scholars heard the contrast as an accusation aimed directly at them. GB continued by comparing old energy to a setting sun and youthful energy to light rising over a new day. The image emphasized direction rather than simple worth. One force was fading from the horizon, while another was beginning its climb. He contrasted exhausted labor with newborn strength, describing youth as a force still capable of sudden growth and unpredictable movement. Another comparison placed quiet withdrawal against the willingness to fight for possibilities that did not yet exist. Each image made the abstract argument sharper, but also increased the chance that hostile listeners would treat metaphor as personal insult. Some senior professors shifted in their seats, no longer hearing a philosophical essay, but a teenager categorizing their entire generation. Younger viewers responded with the opposite emotion, posting that every sentence cut through the banquet's polite attempt to restore rank. The same speech, therefore, created two realities at once: inspiration for people who felt constrained and disrespect for people who felt targeted. GB pressed the central distinction that those who spend their lives preserving existing systems naturally value stability over untested change. He argued that people looking toward the future must sometimes choose bold action, precisely because established rules cannot create unfamiliar outcomes. The message indirectly described his own recent conflict with the International Mathematical Union, without naming the institution again. Had he simply accepted the existing procedure, gold box verification would have remained tied to someone else's schedule and stage. By refusing that arrangement and continuing to produce mathematics, he had forced the procedure itself to adapt around new reality. The essay's logic therefore connected cultural rhetoric to events everyone in the room had personally witnessed during the previous weeks. GB suggested that a country's vitality depends on whether its younger generation is allowed to imagine, attempt, fail, and create independently. If young people are trained only to repeat established judgments, society may preserve knowledge while losing the ability to produce the next breakthrough. That argument did not require older generations to disappear, but it rejected the idea that age automatically gives a veto over younger innovation. Some academics who initially frowned began listening more carefully once the distinction became clearer than the most provocative metaphors suggested. Others remained angry because the rhetoric still placed youth on the side of rising possibility and old age on the side of decline. Zhao maintained his public smile, yet the speech had already moved far beyond the harmless self-criticisms his setup was designed to produce. Charles watched the room rather than Jibai, measuring whether the dispute could reopen divisions that mathematics had temporarily closed. The live stream audience exploded with praise, outrage, explanations, and warnings about how easily individual lines could be weaponized. Smarter viewers noticed that the speech's broad generational language created exactly the clipping opportunity the earlier smear campaign had wanted. A sentence comparing old people with fading things could be separated from the argument and presented as contempt for every elder in society. The coordinated accounts prepared captions claiming GBI had insulted the very generation that built the institutions now honoring him. Writers began drafting opinion pieces before his speech finished, demonstrating that their conclusions had been chosen before context could matter. Some professors who admired GB's mathematics shook their heads, believing the young man had allowed justified confidence to become needless provocation. Others understood why he resisted Zhao's framing, but wished he had answered with less sweeping language in a room containing many uninvolved elders. G5 saw anger spreading through the tables and knew the rhetorical cost of his chosen response was becoming real. He also understood that backing away mid-speech would let attackers claim he had recognized his own disrespect and panicked. So, he continued, keeping his voice controlled rather than turning the disagreement into a personal shouting match with Zhao. The essay moved from describing generations toward a larger claim about national strength and the responsibility placed on young citizens. GB argued that a nation with courageous, imaginative youth possesses a future even when current institutions appear weak or constrained. A nation whose young people learn only fear and obedience can grow old, regardless of how impressive its history once was. That point shifted part of the audience from personal offense toward the broader theme of renewal through education and opportunity. Younger students watching online treated the words as permission to believe their future was not limited by the judgment of existing gatekeepers. For them, GB's own life strengthened the argument because school number 99 had once treated him as nearly worthless. The same adults who dismissed his sleeping, bad scores, and jokes later reinterpreted every habit after the system-driven results appeared. His story did not prove every weak student was a hidden genius, but it demonstrated how unreliable social labels could become. GB therefore challenged the assumption that the safest path for talent was permanent obedience to people with longer resumes. Experience deserved respect when it contained useful knowledge, but respect could not mean surrendering independent judgment whenever generations disagreed. This distinction placed the burden back on ideas and evidence rather than titles, ages, or ceremonial positions. Chazo's original speech had tried to make hierarchy the solution to GBI's sharp personality. GBI's response made hierarchy itself part of the debate. The Water Army organizers ignored those nuances and selected the harshest metaphors for short clips designed to provoke maximum outrage. They prepared headlines accusing GBI of comparing respected elders to useless remnants of a dying age. The source of the speech, its broader national theme, and Zhao's deliberate setup would disappear from those edited versions. People in the hall could see the entire context, but millions, encountering clips later, might receive only the most inflammatory fragments. That information imbalance made the social battle more dangerous than a mathematical proof, where every line remained available for checking. Yiti had survived experts because technical disagreements could be answered with derivations. A distorted quotation could spread faster than any correction. Even so, he refused to return to the safe banquet script and pretend his entire rise should end with obedient gratitude. He looked across the room at angry seniors, worried allies, curious foreign scholars, and cameras carrying the moment beyond the hall. The confidence in his posture no longer resembled the broke student who once expected a 300-point exam and a low-tier college. It came from surviving accusations, official investigation, academic challenges, international pressure, sabotage, and 5 days of expert verification. None of those victories made every opinion correct, but they gave GB reason to trust his own judgment when authority demanded automatic submission. The argument remained unresolved because several listeners still believed his metaphors crossed a line, regardless of the philosophy behind them. Gibi did not ask the hall to erase that disagreement, and he did not end with a demand that everyone praise his attitude. He kept speaking because the source ended while he was still developing the case for a future, shaped by active, independent youth. Behind the cameras, hostile operators believed they finally possessed enough material to attack his character even if they could never defeat his equations. Inside the hall, supporters understood the same danger and waited to see whether the broader argument could survive selective quotation. G raised his chin and addressed the entire room, rather than shrinking his response into a private quarrel with Zhao. His final position in the source was clear even without a completed ending. Mathematical. Respect had not purchased his obedience to seniority. With the hall divided and every camera recording him, G continued defending the right of young people to create, rather than merely obey.